Okay, welcome everyone to our Global Thoughts session here. This is Dr. Barry Gann from St. Bonaventure University in New York. He's a professor of philosophy, but he's also been very involved with peace and justice studies, and that's how we met a number of years ago. And he was kind enough to give us some of his time to discuss a very interesting topic here between peace studies and international education. Before I go on, I just want to let you know that we have two other guest speakers coming up. Jonathan Hansen is the author of Young Fidel. He'll be speaking on July 16th at 2 p.m. And also Fatima Larga Espada, she's a Nicaraguan fencer. She'll be speaking to us on August 3rd at 2 p.m. Okay, thank you very much. And Barry, I turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Tom. First, I want to give thanks to Tom for inviting me to speak with you all, and thank you all for thinking it worth your while to come here. I hope it will be worth our while. And thanks also to Abroadia, Tom's organization, for enabling these kinds of conversations to take place. I'm going to revert to a PowerPoint here and invite all of you to speak up whenever you want to speak up during the course of the PowerPoint. It's going to be pretty leisurely. There's a variety of material, but I'd certainly welcome people's participation as we move along in the hour. So let me share a screen here and we'll go from there. And I can't quite, there we go. So Tom asked me to speak about what role peace studies could play in international education. And as I told Tom, I'd never really thought about it at much length, but about 2 months or so ago, I began thinking about it more. I want to begin first by saying that for me, peace studies really involves nonviolence for reasons you'll see in a moment in the presentation. And nonviolence requires an understanding of the different aspects of violence, I think. The more people become sensitized to what violence is and can appreciate the scope of things that constitute violence, the more I think one can become more nonviolent themselves just by sensitizing oneself to it. So let's move along here and see what we can do. I want to talk first about the ambivalence of the term peace studies. Working with the Peace and Justice Studies Association for many years, it became quite apparent to me that there is a lot of ambivalence to the term. It could mean, for example, the study of how to obtain peace, peace as a goal. And when you think about this, you realize that West Point and the people who work there and study there have peace as a goal as well. NATO has peace as a goal. The Warsaw Pact has peace as a goal. And so I think when we talk about peace studies, we need to speak in terms wider than peace simply as a goal, because it opens up the door to obtaining peace through war and other forms of violence. Anyone want to comment about that at all before we proceed on? Another ambivalent aspect of the term peace studies is the study of how to be peaceful, peace as a means. And to some extent in my own program at St. Bonaventure University, I do a lot of focus on this. In fact, I spend the first 5 minutes of every one of my classes for the last 25 years or so in moments of silence, which some people call meditation, but I just tell my students it's learning how to be alone with oneself and learning how to control oneself and not always reacting to everything that's around you. But again, one can get caught up in this to the point where one leaves the world and doesn't really become concerned with issues of justice because you simply left the material world and focused upon your individual development and nothing more than that. So I like to follow Gandhi and think of peace studies as the study of how to achieve peace through peaceful means, sort of combining the first two ambivalencies of the term. Gandhi said, the means may be likened to a seed, the end to a tree. and there's just the same inviolable connection between the means and the end as there is between the seed and the tree. And this is from his book Hind Swaraj, which he wrote in 1909 on a trip back from England to South Africa. So any comments about this term peace studies and the different aspects that the term can take, the concept can take?
Excuse me, Barry.
I don't.
Do you feel then that the study of how to achieve peace as a goal can be more often a Western approach versus perhaps a more Eastern cultural approach? Or would you not assign that? I was looking at the NATO and what you had listed as examples.
No, I simply picked NATO and West Point and
Okay.
Warsaw Pact because they were the first to come to mind as I was looking for photos, actually.
Okay.
No, I think programs in the West can also focus very much on internal development to the exclusion of considerations of justice and international relations. But in general, I was surprised when I joined the Peace and Justice Studies Association many years ago that so many people were from international relations and history and political science. And when they talked about peace studies, it had much more to do with creating institutions that would actually be at odds with one another as we went along. And my own program has been criticized by some of my former students as being too focused on internal nonviolence rather than nonviolence as a means to achieving social change, as in the Arab Spring and so forth.
Okay.
And I really think they need to be combined. That's why I brought out these ambivalencies. Anyone else? Let's see if I can go back to my screen sharing here. So as I was saying at the outset, I think understanding how to be peaceful or how to be nonviolent requires an awareness of the nature of violence. And as one becomes aware of the nature of violence, I think one can become more sensitized to what violence is. And that is one of the biggest steps that one can take toward, I think, promoting nonviolence in oneself and in others. So scholars, as many of you are probably aware, have identified violence in a variety of forms. The sort of violence that people think of immediately is physical violence. And physical violence can range from domestic abuse in the home to this picture that many of you can recognize. I can't recognize it. It's either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. I'm not sure which. They sort of get lumped together. But you can go all the way, the entire range from interpersonal violence to international violence. So that's what people usually think of when they think of physical violence, those sorts of physical harms that range from the personal to the international. But also scholars talk about psychological violence. And one of the things I want to stress is that wherever there is physical violence, like in these two places, there is also psychological violence. I don't think you can have physical violence without psychological violence being an accompaniment of that. But you can, I think, have psychological violence without having physical violence. And we don't often think of sitcoms as being violent, but I do, because many of them involve laughing at people being demeaned, at people being made fun of, at people being talked down to, at people being insulted. And we accept that as a kind of humor throughout television and movies. And there's some movies that I've had to walk out on just because I no longer found them funny. I just found them violent. Comments about that at all? So the point really being that I don't think you can have physical violence without psychological violence accompanying it, but you can have psychological violence without physical violence. That means that psychological violence is more common than physical violence, just mathematically. There's also the form of violence that a lot of people like to talk about, Johann Galtung, I think, introduced this term some years ago, structural violence. And so I pulled up this photo of a famous Norman Rockwell painting and contrasted it with one I just saw the other day on Facebook. And we're hearing a lot about the structural violence in police forces these days. And I think a lot of that structural violence is not directed only against the public, but is directed even against the police themselves within police forces, who often don't feel free to speak out about what they see because of pressures from unions and pressures from peers and so forth. And that's not unique to police forces. I think we can, all of you can, if you're in academia, can talk about professors you know who do things that you think they ought to be held accountable for. And we don't speak out publicly about those professors. There's even a circle of protection within academia, as there is within among lawyers, and as there is among doctors, and so forth. So that's kind of structural. That's one aspect of structural violence, this fear of speaking out against violence when one sees it because of the milieu in which one finds oneself. But a lot more could be said about structural violence than that. And any comments or additions? Then, of course, environmental violence, which can be an accompaniment of structural violence. But even wind farms, which many people think of as being quite green, wreak a tremendous amount of destruction on the environment. There were many pictures that I could have chosen, but this was one. And of course, the plastic waste in the oceans, to say nothing of the rollback of laws in the last of environmental laws in the United States in the last 3 years that have been intended to protect communities, and now they're not even being enforced. So that's another kind of environmental violence, I would suggest. Then just wanted to throw it open, see whether people could think of other forms of violence that we couldn't put under the umbrellas I've opened up so far. If not, I want to use these, excuse me, these forms of violence as a template. And I'm having a little trouble reading my own PowerPoint because of the Zoom pop-ups here, but international peace education should entail an understanding of how each of these forms of violence manifests itself within a given country. So if you have students studying abroad, I think, and you want to do something with respect to peace education with your students, one of the things you could do is simply talk about the violence in these different forms that exists in the country that the student is visiting or will be visiting. You can talk about physical violence in these countries. What should students know about physical violence in a country? Before I pull up some other things on screen here, what do you think students should know about physical violence in another country? Before they visit it, when they visit it?
Hi, Barry. I think they definitely should. They should know before they arrive, you know, what the situation is or what type of violence there is. You know, for example, with me, with Cuba, I'll speak more because I've been there for the last 7 years. I guess you could, in a way, the embargo. I guess that would be a structural violence, right? The embargo and the denial of food and medical supplies, I think, is something that I always stress to my students before they arrive, because for many Americans, they don't know what happens to Cuba because there's just a lack of information.
Right.
But before I go on, Barry, Bill Holmes asked a very good question on the chat. I don't know if you saw it, so I'll just read it. He says, I don't know if you can see it. He says, I'll just quote. He said, I don't want to make an untoward comment, but could the fear and uncertainty of employment in higher education now aid in creating a form of emotional violence?
Do I need to answer that question? I think it most certainly does. There are issues at Bonaventure that have come up over the summer where I have urged faculty without tenure and staff who are concerned about these issues just to be quiet and not even be a part of the noise that some of us might raise, because those are definite fears. I think that's true anywhere. Does Bill want to say more about that? This is only, as I was telling Tom, my 5th time using Zoom. I've had the good fortune of being on sabbatical all year, so I didn't have to contend with what many of you have had to contend with, although I was in China when Wuhan was closed down. So anyway, okay, so I mean, these are some of the questions that I think students should know about a country before they go there or when they're there. What's the level of domestic violence in the country in which one finds oneself? What are the rates of violent crime? These are things you want to tell students before they go anyway, just so they know where they should go on the streets, where they shouldn't go, what's customary in a particular country and so on. How much of the country's budget is spent on the military or on prisons? These are just a sample of questions that I think students might want to acquaint themselves with if they want to do peace studies as part of their international program. You can ask the same things about psychological violence. How many reporters are killed or jailed annually? We're beginning to see things like that happening in this country now, to my shock and surprise, even though we've only been about 30th on the US, that is, has only been ranked about 30th in terms of freedom of the press for the last 20 or 30 years. And it's only gotten worse, I'd say, in the last 2 months. But that's, reporters being killed or jailed is certainly something that takes a psychological toll on the entire citizenry. Who controls the press? How happy are people in the country? What are their fears? We'll talk more about this in a later part of the PowerPoint. What's the level of domestic violence in the country in which one finds oneself? Again, that's because domestic violence is both physical and psychological. So, is there a death penalty? My wife is from China. I've met a number of Chinese people over the last 10 years since I met my wife. And people in China speak pretty freely of putting people to death when they commit certain crimes, and I'm always sort of horrified myself to hear how freely people will speak of it, because it's just an accepted penalty in China. So, any comments so far? What's the incarceration rate? Many of you know the United States actually has more people in prison than any other country in the world, including China and India. Not just the highest rate per capita, but the highest rate period, highest number period. What protections are workers offered? Are unions tolerated? Are unions encouraged? These are all things, the lack of which, or the presence of which, contribute to psychological violence in a country. And students would learn a lot about the country by getting answers to these questions, even before they visit the country. Is there freedom of speech, assembly, and press? I'm going to talk briefly, shortly, about what students should be doing while they're in the country, but I want to focus first on what they might learn before they go there. Structural or institutional violence, what's the per capita income of the country? You made a little bit of reference to that, Tom, with respect to Cuba. How great are the disparities in wealth? When I visit China, I'm just astonished at the disparity of wealth there, but it's just because it's more apparent, I think, than it is here. The disparity is probably greater here than it is in China, but you can walk 2 blocks away from one of the great buildings in the world and immediately be in a little street with storefront shops and people selling nuts and bolts and living off of that. What's the unemployment rate in the country? Is there a commitment to everyone being employed? Is there not a commitment to that? Is it simply a matter of market forces, or does the government attempt to see that everyone has a job? How much does the average person spend on health care? Do they get health care as a guarantee, or is it something you've got to pay for? So forth. What's the average age to which people live, which certainly affects the way one thinks about oneself. 250 years ago in this country, in the United States, that is, people lived to be 42, 43 years on average. That meant you married when you were 13 or 14 or 15. That didn't mean you could wait till you were 30 or 35. These kinds of factors that influence the age to which people live also influence how people conceive of themselves and how they conceive of how they should live their lives. And again, who controls the press is partly a matter of structural violence, not just psychological violence. And then with respect to environmental violence, you can ask questions like this: what's the infant mortality rate? What's the average age to which people live? Again, what's the prevalence of various diseases and illnesses, which will tell you a lot about environmental factors in a country. So you can then also ask, how about the country and the companies within the country? What do they do to the people within the country, and what do they do to people outside of the country? What wars has the country been involved in? Why have they been involved in those wars? To what extent have they been involved in them? What percentage of the country's budget is devoted to military, to police? I have police in there. I actually meant to take it out because in thinking about reconstructing police forces in the United States, it's occurred to me that one of the big problems is we conceive of police as being a police force, but we could conceive of police very differently in terms of being a peace force. Again, my wife from China tells me that police in China are divided into two different groups: those who deal with violent crimes and those who don't. And even conceiving of police that way would, for our country, for the United States, for my country, would change a lot. What damage does a country and its corporations do to the environment within and without the country? Are there insurrections, terrorist groups, or independent militias at work within the country? These are all sort of outside the realm of structural, institutional violence, but they do play a role with physical and psychological violence. So, as I said earlier, these questions can all be explored without doing any international study, any international travel to study, without meeting people from other countries. You can just open up books and get answers to all of those questions. So I want to, at this point, talk with you and perhaps learn from you as well. What would make it different about visiting another country? What value can travel add to these investigations? What might travel be able to reveal that books cannot? And I think, again, largely from my experiences in China, but also I've visited Russia and Bangladesh, Canada and Mexico, of course, but a lot of things you can learn from just talking to people in other countries. My daughter visited France for 6 weeks after her freshman year of college. She never met a French person the 6 weeks she was in France. She just hung out with all of her friends from Arizona State. And they went around from one tourist site to another and attended the classes they had to attend, but never actually spoke. She spoke with more French people in our home in the United States than she did living in Paris. And that's true. So that's that last point there. So I think it's really important for students to meet local people, and then they can pursue other sorts of questions that add a lot of depth to the questions we already talked about. What are your most popular foods? What's their meaning? What's their significance? Where do they come from and why? A lot of times foods can reveal all kinds of things about culture, including fears and national identity and so forth. How's the education system set up? Who controls it? What purposes does it serve? And here you do well to talk to people from the low economic strata as well as the high economic strata, because many countries, especially in Latin America, divide their education systems up between rich and poor, public and private, even more so than we do in the United States. And talking to students about this and teachers could be much more informative than reading in books about it. Where does the music in the country come from? What instruments are native to the country? Can you play those instruments for me? Well, how did you get introduced to the instrument? You can learn a lot from a culture by trading music with people. How have the geographical features of the country contributed to the people's sense of well-being or insecurity? You know, so in China, you've got the Great Wall across the north, and in the middle of the country, you've got the Qinjiang Mountain, not Xinjiang, Qingling Mountains that run like our Rocky Mountains in the United States, which run north to south and divide the Midwest from the West. You've got in China a huge mountain range that divides the north from the south. And that has affected cultures greatly. You've got wheat growing in the north and you've got rice growing in the south. And so you've got two completely different kinds of food in one country, and two completely different kinds of cultures built around the food system. What does this mean in terms of weather patterns and how that contributes to people's fears and so forth? Who are the minorities in the country? How do they feel about how they've been treated, past and present? And if you could meet minority groups in another country and talk with them, you would learn a great deal about the violence within a particular country. So let me pause here for a moment, see whether anyone wants to add anything here or ask anything. Another item here about talking to people, talking to women about their treatment, past and present, within a country will also tell you a lot about the extent to which feminism has taken hold and the equality of rights has or has not taken hold. And then I think it's important to learn about a nation's history, not from what we read from an outside nation about that nation, but how that nation studies about itself. And this is best learned, I think, from local people too. How has the country suffered at the hands of other countries? I spoke with Palestinians and Israelis at Chautauqua Institution a number of years ago, and I suggested to the two different parties I was talking to that they both regarded themselves as victims. Jews, of course, from the Holocaust, and Palestinians from the Israeli occupation. And a Palestinian woman at the table said, "I'm sick of hearing about the Holocaust." You know, so that's really revealing when you have people wanting to regard themselves as victims and denying that other people within a country are victims. So really useful to talk to people about how they feel they have suffered. What are the principles that define the nation? You know, the United States was very big on what we called manifest destiny. Do other nations have comparable concepts? Do they have a very different sort of concept? You know, how do they think of themselves nationally? And then how do they think of themselves in relation to other peoples of the world? What do they call themselves and why? The Chinese refer to themselves as Zhongwen, which means middle people. They think of themselves as being in the middle kingdom. What are their negative terms for other peoples, right? What are the insults they use when they talk about groups that they regard as their enemies? Whom do they regard as their enemies and why? That's very useful, I think, for understanding a culture. Why did those terms arise? Does, as I mentioned this already, does the nation have a concept of its own destiny? Or is it a nation that simply thinks of itself as things happening to itself? And then to sort of wrap things up in terms of my formal presentation, there's this question of international violence, and I only came up with one example here. But many people are unaware that 120 years ago, passports and visas were not required for travel between countries. People simply crossed borders. This all changed after World War I. We accept it without any thinking about it now. In the United States, as many of you know, we have what are called green cards for permanent residents. Gandhi's first protest in South Africa was a protest against green cards. They didn't call them that. It was called the Black Act, that required all Indian nationals to register and always carry around a card, and they could be thrown in prison or thrown out of the country if they didn't have that card with them. Same as in the US now. But we have come to accept green cards as being a normal course of affairs, when in fact, 120 years ago, no nations required anything like that. People were free to travel from one nation to another. What does this say about violence on an international scale? Those of us living in the US right now, I can't travel to China. I can't travel to Canada. It's very interesting. I understand the reasons for it in this particular pandemic time, but it's very interesting that governments control this now, and 120 years ago, nobody even thought about controlling this. So my conclusion to the formal presentation is just that I think when you answer the first set of questions that you can get out of books, and then the second set of questions that are best learned from meeting locals and talking with locals, you can, I think, understand the levels of violence in a country, the factors that contribute to that violence, and then you can start talking about, gee, how can we bring peace to the world, greater peace to a particular country, and so forth. So I hope that is helpful, and we can talk from here.
Thank you, Barry. Let's see if anyone has any questions.
Hi, Barry. My name is Sam Cardamone. I work at SUNY Geneseo College. I have a number of colleagues who have a lot of touch points with Bonaventure University. I just want to say thank you first and foremost. This has been an illuminating, I'm fortunate to work in international education, which is constantly forcing me to think about shifting my perspective in a number of different ways. And this certainly helps contextualize our work in a different and unique way. What it got me thinking about is, working in international education, there's a lot of things that we are, from a compliance and best practice standpoint, I'm sorry, I didn't realize I didn't have my video on. Hi. Sorry about that.
Okay.
In international education, it's kind of this interesting space straddling the professional administrative world of higher education, as well as the pedagogical academic world. I think we're constantly at the nexus of those things. And I see compliance as like minimally what international education must do to ensure the health and safety, as well as abide by regulations. And then there's best practice, which is this much higher standard, in which case we strive to really maximize the learning potential that international education is baked into it. And what you just presented is, to me, like, what we can strive for in terms of best practice, from what we often refer to as like pre-departure education, what a student should be learning about a place before they arrive there, so that it's not all brand new information overload, but they're arriving with context. They're arriving with some knowledge, and I personally ascribe to the mentality. There's a intercultural competence theorist, Darla Deardorff, who uses a framework of knowledge, skills, and attitude. And if we can, the skills and attitudes are things that I think often develop more in country. Certainly people can learn about them ahead of time, but what you've just described is a framework to kind of educate on the knowledge side before a student arrives, so that there can be greater growth and development on the skills and attitude side of things. So my dilemma, I guess, in the international education space is thinking from the very procedural standpoint of like, what can a study abroad office, international education office do, so that it's not just a suggestion that like, hey, because many of the questions you posed are questions that we have as part of our pre-departure education, that we say to students, it would be really worthwhile for you to educate yourself about these things. It would be, it would be a useful tool that a lot of students, we encourage them to utilize a journal. And we'd say, one of the first things you can begin doing is journaling on these questions. Journal on these questions by seeking out the answers and generating more questions from it. Like if you learn that that the incarceration rate is the second highest in the world for the country that you're going to, why? and delving into that. So I'm curious of your reaction to my, I guess, characterization of the international education as this space of intersection of pedagogy and administrative staff support, and how international education can work more hand in hand with faculty members to maximize student learning.
So I haven't been involved in international education directly, only through my daughter, and then to the extent to which I've been asked to speak at universities in other countries. But I think one of the things administrators of these programs could be doing, based on my daughter's experience in France, is making sure that there are local contacts, local people that students do engage with. I noticed the international students at St. Bonaventure University, they sit at the same lunch table every day. They do the same activities together. They hang out together. It's a comfort zone, I get that. But I think administration could do well to try and expand that comfort zone by having programs planned in advance that would enable greater contact with locals. Does that help at all?
Yeah, no, that certainly provides a framework for the in-country aspect and enhancing that in-country aspect to further facilitate. And I think a lot of U.S. universities strive for that, and the level of engagement, having been on the side of trying of organizing different things like that, the level of engagement leaves something to be desired. Yeah,
that's what I don't know about what's.
But thank you.
What hasn't been attempted. So
sure, absolutely.
Sam, if I may, my name is Joan Williams. I was with IES Abroad, study abroad provider for many years. And while we did a lot of pre-departure, and certainly our programming offered a lot of experiential learning opportunities to students, we also felt it was very important when they came back from their experience to articulate what they had learned, and to even engage with international students on campus to verify, or at least discuss with them what they had learned in terms of these things that Barry has brought up in terms of peace studies. And I think it was a means of enabling those students to kind of go full circle on what they had done, what they had thought about, what they had encountered in local cultures, and then be able to articulate it to others, solidified it as their experience that way. So I think that third element, you've got the pre-departure, you've got their experience, but upon re-entry, you want them to be able to bring it all together.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Joan. I didn't even think of the post experience, post-travel experience. And it would also, I think, help international students at one's home university feel more comfortable to know that there are others who understand the culture they came from. So, while you were speaking, it occurred to me too, I might mention, it would be useful to learn about the nonviolent heroes of a particular culture. I didn't even bring that up. But who are the nonviolent heroes in one country or another?
I have a question if no one has a question. I'm sure others will be coming up, but I always envisioned like a concept of like study abroad solidarity. And by that, I mean, people, those of us in international education say, look, in terms of solidarity with someone else, we will take this action. So there's two things that come to mind. One is the murder of Jamal Khashoggi there in Turkey by some people from the Saudi embassy. I think a manifestation of study abroad solidarity would be that those people that have study abroad programs in Saudi Arabia said, all right, we're suspending these programs because this is because of this assault on human rights, right? This is a political violence, I guess you could say that. The other case, and I don't know if too many people know about this, but it's Matthew Hedges was a British researcher doing some research in I think Abu Dhabi, and he was arrested, and he was sentenced to life in prison. I know there's a few providers, again, have study abroad programs in Abu Dhabi. The most famous one, of course, is New York University. I would have liked to see New York University and all these other providers say, look, hey, we're out of here. We're suspending our programs to show solidarity with Matthew Hedges. So I guess my question to you, Barry, is am I just fantasizing this thing, or is this something that could actually happen, study abroad solidarity?
So you had warned me about this question in advance, Tom, and you understand and all of you understand better than I, the connections between the different study abroad programs, what connections exist, what connections don't exist. So in terms of whether it's fantasy or not, I think you can answer that question better than I, but in terms of whether it's possible organizationally and so on, I would say it most certainly is. It just, nonviolent political action, which is what that would be, requires far more planning than most people think. The Arab Spring looked to most Americans like a series of spontaneous uprisings, but in fact, they were planned by student groups and sometimes coordinated by trainers out of the US, in fact, for years in advance of their happening, going back to 2003, 2004, before things erupted in 2010, 2011, 2012. So there'd be a lot of groundwork to be done in terms of forming alliances between the study abroad programs to be ready for such occasions. And the only thing that I think I can caution about is you really need to be sure of your facts before you take an action on something. And even in the cases of Matthew Hedges and Jamal Khashoggi, there's so many facts still missing. I think probably the gist of it all is very clear, but to make a case for it that you can present publicly, it becomes very difficult to do credibly without, you never want to lose your credibility. And so you risk losing credibility as a study abroad program if you don't have all your facts before you when you take an action like this. And if you don't do it in solidarity, you're really out there. But you knew all that before I said any of it. So.
Sorry, I just wanted to add to what Tom was saying, and then Barry. Sorry, my name is Anna, in case people missed it before. And I'm not turning my camera on because my Wi-Fi is very bad. So, but I was just, I think part of going off of what Barry said too, I think there's very few peace and conflict human rights issues that are clean cut, and you'd be able to clearly identify the source of violence and who should be, who you should direct that solidarity towards. And I think part of it too is also thinking about ourselves as Americans, and the way Americans tend to take the moral high road and say, well, let's act in solidarity against Abu Dhabi. Well, I would say then, Europeans or, other universities around the world really who are looking at what's happening in the US right now with racial violence would say, well, we're not going to send our exchange students to America in standing in solidarity with the Black community here. So I think, when I think about taking action, and that's not me saying that there shouldn't be solidarity between international education. It's just me saying, I think we've also got to be wary of being those Americans like, oh, let's, take a claim of moral highness when we all know that the US is far from that. And obviously then, the implications of that in terms of politics and, have a reverberating effect. And I don't know, maybe I'm off base with that, but sometimes I think it's hard to say, let's identify something that's happening and take solidarity action when we might not necessarily know who exactly to pin it on, and who exactly our actions are then going to negatively affect, because most likely it won't be the people that we're trying to negatively affect, if that makes sense.
It does. I'd like to comment on it, but I see Asuma wanted to say something too here. So, oh, we need to unmute Asuma. Yeah.
Can you hear me all?
Yes.
Thanks so much, Barry, for your presentation. I had a quick 2 questions. So historically, I think that we have had too many wars using military to kind of halt violence and try to bring peace to countries or to the world. So I was wondering if we can switch that and look at what are the elements of a peaceful society to study a peaceful countries. So this is one of my questions. The other one is, as an international educators or enthusiast, can we study peace without focusing on the absence of violence? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Writing these down, Asuma, so I can respond to you. Can we study peace without the aspect of violence was your second?
Yes.
Okay. So let me come back first to what Anna was saying and comment on that, and then I'll turn to your questions. I'll see if anyone else wants to say more about Anna's comments too. Tom, in listening to what Anna said, I'm rethinking my response to you a little bit. You have to, I think international education is a really, really good thing because it gets people talking to one another. And I think, if we were to punish China for what's going on in Xinjiang province or maybe even Hong Kong or something like that by canceling study abroad programs, we'd be doing a lot more harm than good. What we really need to be doing is keeping lines of communication open with as many people as we can and learning their values and sharing ours. And so closing things off as a form of punishment itself is a kind of violent action. It's punitive, and it might be more beneficial to do just the opposite. One can still try to speak to these things without shutting down programs as a form of punishment. So that was the one comment I wanted to make after I listened to what Anna had to say. Asuma, let me take your second question first, because I find that one a little easier to answer. Can we study peace without the aspect of violence? Which is related, I guess, to your first question too, but I'm inclined to say no. I'm inclined to say that I don't myself know what it means to be nonviolent unless I know what it means to be violent. And that doesn't mean that nonviolence is a derivative of violence. Gandhi never liked using the term nonviolence. That's why he helped create the term satyagraha, holding on to truth. But at least in my own experience, it's when I can recognize what I'm doing as a violent act that I'm able to rein myself in. So maybe you have something else in mind when you ask that. Let me turn to your first question and then ask you a little more, Asuma. But can we look at peaceful examples instead of violent examples like the military? That I think can be done, which is one of the reasons. Again, I thought maybe it was after Joan spoke that I said we should perhaps be looking at the nonviolent heroes and exemplars in a given country. As a way of learning more about that country's culture too. So I think to answer your first question, can we use peaceful examples instead of violent examples to learn about peace? Absolutely. Can we study peace without studying violence? I'm inclined to say no, but I'm not giving you any good reasons except my own personal experience. Do you want to respond to that at all, Asuma? Or is...
Sorry, I missed your question. I have the, can you repeat that again? Your answer for the second question?
Oh, just, I don't think we can study what it means to be peaceful without at the same time understanding what it means to be violent. I have just, Tom, to pick on you perhaps unfairly, because you do it with a good heart and a good intention, but your suggestion that maybe we have a solidarity against a nation for a wrong that they've engaged in, it might be important to be able to recognize that as violent before we think we're doing something that's peaceful. And so that requires sensitizing oneself, I think, to what violence is. So the second question you asked, Asuma, I would say, no, I don't think we can study what it means to be peaceful without at the same time understanding what it means to be violent, and expanding that concept of violence. But I do think that it helps to look at peaceful examples, as your first question asked, to understand ways of responding nonviolently. The famous example in philosophy is what do you do if a Nazi comes to your door and says, are you hiding any Jews in your house? And Kant would say, you always have to tell the truth. So if you are, you got to tell them, and otherwise you've got to lie, and then you're breaking a moral duty. But a good moral exemplar might be someone who says, I don't like what you're doing, and I'm not going to cooperate with you, and I'm not going to answer your question one way or the other. Close the door on them and take your chances. That there's often a third or a fourth route that we don't know about unless we study nonviolent exemplars.
I just want to add something really quick, Barry. I just uploaded the Halkidiki Declaration onto the chat, so people, you can take a look at that, download it. We don't have enough time to discuss it. All I'm going to say is this was a very unique document that was put out by the Institute for International Education in 2002. But then ever since then, it has disappeared. You can't find a trace of it anywhere. And more importantly, it's really disappeared from all forms of discussion, conversation in the field. So for those of you who are here, thank you. Just take a look at that and just keep it in mind. And you will see the connections between international education and peace studies that Barry has been elaborating on. And just keep those things in mind as you keep moving forward and working with within international education. So that's all my point. I don't know who else would like have any other questions.
Tom, were you going to wrap things up at 3? Is that?
Yes, I was, yeah. So
I just want to thank you again and thank those of you who signed in on Zoom for participating in this. It's been helpful to me to hear what people are doing. So.
Well, thank you very much, Barry. I appreciate it. I know you're busy, and this was a lot of fun. I hope everyone else had fun. I enjoyed it. It got me thinking, because I was very. I'm reconsidering my study abroad solidarity thing. I had never considered it as possibly a manifestation of violent. But I think that shows us that international educators, we can have the capacity to grow and really learn from these type of conversations. So thank you very much, Barry, for your time.
Thank you. My pleasure.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.